Hello, I'm Tim Smith with the Adams County Historical Society. And as part of our series about Gettysburg's visual battle damage, I wanted to talk today a little bit about some of the artillery shells in the buildings in the town. By my count, there are 9 buildings in town that have artillery shells or cannonballs sticking out of them to this day. Now, of course, that is not counting ones that are outside the borough of Gettysburg, like the Benner house, which is kind of in Strabane Township, has an artillery shell in it. And it doesn't count holes in buildings such as the Trossel barn on the battlefield, which is in Cumberland Township. So we're just talking about the borough. And I thought that we would do videos on several of the different buildings in the town that still have artillery shells in them and talk about them. I think, as I mentioned in the video I did on bullet holes in buildings, when you stop a bus in front of a building and then you point over and you show an artillery shell, you get an instant reaction by the people who are on your tour. It doesn't take much imagination to see the artillery shell sticking out of the building, to know that a family was huddled in that basement during the fighting when the artillery shell struck. And you can only imagine the fear of that family, waiting to hear if the artillery shell was going to explode, if other shells would come into the house. It was a real danger during the battle, these artillery shells being fired over the town. Right now, we're standing at the northeast corner of the town at the time of the battle. And Stratton Street is just off to my left, and behind me would be some fields leading to the rear lots of York Street. And it was here in John Kuhn's Brickyard on the afternoon of July 1st that Charles Coster's brigade was moved out to make a stand against the advancing Confederate soldiers in this area. There were 3 regiments that came up along Stratton Street and formed in this brickyard. The 134th New York Infantry, the 154th New York Infantry, and the 27th Pennsylvania Infantry that formed here. And as luck would have it, this brigade was sent out here to sort of cover the retreat of the 11th Army Corps on the afternoon of July 1st, which was retreating back from the area we refer to as Barlow's Knoll across the almshouse and through the town. And this brigade arrived in this area just a few minutes before 2 Southern brigades made their appearance. Behind the camera is sort of a little rise of ground that slowly descends to Rock Creek. And directly in front of me, the Louisiana Tigers, Harry Hayes's brigade on July 1st came into this area. Their line of battle would have extended beyond Stratton Street towards Carlisle Street. And you can actually see them pictured on the mural behind us advancing in their attack. And Isaac Avery's North Carolina brigade actually outflanked Coster's brigade by quite a distance, and they came across Rock Creek and up and over this rise of ground where today there's a development. And they drove into these troops, and Coster's brigade was driven back. And it was during the height of this battle that Confederate artillery would have been shelling the retreating troops through the town. Of course, we're going to talk about some artillery shells in buildings, and we're not exactly sure when the artillery shells hit the building. But on the mural behind me, the artist, Mark Dunkelman, who repainted this in recent years, actually has placed 2 houses along Stratton Street in his mural. One on the left is the John Kuhn house, and of course this was Kuhn's Brickyard, where this fight took place. And just on the other side of Stratton Street is the George Crass house, sometimes referred to as the Crass-Barbehenn house, and we'll talk about this in a moment. There were actually two other houses on Stratton Street to the right of the Kuhn house at the time of the battle. One was owned by John Kuhn's brother, Franklin Kuhn, and then beside that one, a little north of that one, was a house that had been built just a short time before the battle by Jacob Kadori. So there's actually four houses in this area at the time. But it's interesting that in the George Crass-Barbehenn, Henry Barbehenn house, he actually has a little artillery shell sticking out of the building near the spot where the artillery shell sticks out today. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the subject of artillery shells in the buildings in the town, the Adams County Historical Society Journal in 1996 published an article on Gettysburg's visual battle damage. And of course, the article is by me. And in the article, I have a map that shows the buildings in the town that have the artillery shells in it. And we're going to put a copy of this map in the comments section of this video. So please subscribe to our channel, and you can then have access to the comments so that you can download this map. And then you can go around town and you can look for the artillery shells in the buildings yourself. As I was saying, along North Stratton Street, there were four houses at the time of the Civil War. So what had happened was the old Harrisburg Road came out of the town sort of on an angle and came through this very area and out where the old Harrisburg Road is today. And at some point in the 1840s, they extended North Stratton Street up here to meet the intersection of the Harrisburg Road. And then eventually this area was developed, but not until shortly before the American Civil War. As a matter of fact, the houses on this side of the street were built in 1860 and 1861. So the John Kuhn house is the first house here, the Bayes house, and you can see there's a Civil War plaque on it. The second house, the red one, which has a Civil War plaque on it, is the Franklin Kuhn house. And it was actually myself and Randy Miller that helped the owner of that house get that Civil War plaque in more recent years. And beyond it is the Jacob Kadori house that's been greatly altered, but that's also partly a Civil War structure. So these three houses along here stood on North Stratton Street. And on the other side of the street, of course, we have the Crass-Barbehenn house, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But let's return over here to the Kuhn house. We don't know anything about exactly when the artillery shell hit the building, or there's no account that describes it. But I should point out that it obviously came from the direction of Cemetery Hill. And this is a 3-inch Hotchkiss shell in the side of this building. And this one can be pointed out on car tours of the battlefield, at least if you're driving along this section of the street. It's pretty easy to point out. And John Kuhn and his family lived here at the time of the battle. I should mention, we do have a 1908 account by a visitor to the area who was a veteran that fought in the Brickyard fight. And he actually mentions seeing an artillery shell in the buildings, one of the buildings near the Brickyard. And we think he's referring to this artillery shell. But that's all we know about it. Now, the Barbehenn house, we should point out across the street, was built around 1860. It was built by George Crass, and he actually was employed by the Gettysburg Gas Company. And the gas street lights and gas was available for houses in the town, I believe starting in 1861, early 1861. And in 1860 or so, he built this house. Now, he sold it to Henry Barbehenn and his family, I believe in 1864. But there's good evidence that both the Crass family and the Barbehenn family lived in the structure at the time of the battle. So we're sitting here on the north side of the Crass-Barbehenn house. And I should mention that this is private property. And we have permission from the owner of the house to come into the yard and talk about this. This is definitely a Civil War building. And it was built, we believe, around, off the top of my head, 1860. Maybe it was completed in 1861. It has battle damage. There are places on the building where you can clearly see bullet holes in the side of the building. At the time of the Civil War, the building ended here. You can see the division in the bricks, and this is a post-Civil War addition that's been placed on. But up on the second floor of the house, you can clearly see a Confederate reed shell sticking out of the building. Now, Henry Barbehenn lived here with his family at the time of the battle, and eventually they bought the building and handed down to their children and grandchildren. And the Barbehenn grandchildren lived here, I believe, into the 80s, the 1980s. In the 1970s, this house received a Civil War plaque by the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable. And the person who was putting the plaques on the buildings and doing the research for them was a guy named Harlan Stewart. And he came and interviewed the granddaughters. And they told him that during the fighting, 2 artillery shells came through the building. And you can still see the damage where the artillery shells came through upstairs. And they told him it was their understanding that the artillery shells came in from the southeast. And they went through the building, and one of them stuck in this side of the house. Now, of course, the problem with that is that the artillery shell today is facing the other direction. You can see a huge amount of damage around the artillery shell. Most likely, it went completely through the building, and then they obtained another shell or the same shell, and they put the shell in the side of the building, and they repointed the bricks around it, but you can still see that the damage created by the artillery shell when it went through the structure. I'm inclined to believe that it's more likely that this shell came into the building or damaged the building during the first day of the battle, when the Southern artillery would have been placed along Jones's Avenue. And we know that out the Harrisburg Road near what is now the Gettysburg Lutheran home, and that artillery was shelling this area. So we know that. So it's most likely a result of the first day's fighting and not the third day's fighting. So we have special permission by the owners of the building to come into the house and examine for ourselves. And I have never been in the house, and I had never seen this before. In the 1971 letter written by Harlan Stewart, he describes inside of the house the battle damage you can still witness where the 2 artillery shells came through the house, and they have never been repaired. And here you can see them for the first time. And, according to the account given by the granddaughters, the artillery shell came through the outside of the house, through this wall, and then one of them lodged in the outside of the building, which again seems a little unlikely, but the battle damage is in the wall just as written about by Harlan Stewart.